As we come to 2 Samuel in chapter 1, we might think of the many situations around us that feel like a time of crisis. There's political upheaval. We might hear the news of another Christian leader who falls. We might think of the wars and the persecution in other countries. Maybe closer to home, we maybe have a loved one who died. Or you hit a really difficult situation in life, as the things that we prayed for already. Times of crisis in society or very close to us personally. And we see them in the Bible, and as Christians we are called to respond in a godly way, in a God-word way, focused on God, keeping Him in the picture to respond well. Now, as we continue our look through the life of Saul and David in the book of 1 Samuel, we finished that last time, but now we continue into 2 Samuel. And so on the pages of our Bibles, we see in big bold letters with a lot of white space, 2 Samuel. And it might seem that a whole new story starts and a new book, and you think, oh, well, we're starting something new. It's not really the case. This is really the continuation of the story that we've been following. A continuation of the book of 1 Samuel, specifically, but really the story of the whole Bible, the unfolding plan of God with the history of His people leading up to the time that Jesus came and then on into our times. In a way, I think you can compare it with television series nowadays, how they are structured, right, with episodes and then seasons, like groups of episodes that tell a longer story. If you can say the individual chapters in these books, or maybe the way I've put them together in sermons, as we've considered it so far, those are the episodes. Sort of united stories, a bit of a storyline, but they are part of a bigger thing. And then we've seen several seasons, as it were, in this big series. You could say in 1 Samuel, to just recap briefly what's happened so far, You got the prologue, the pilot for the whole series. That was the birth of Samuel being announced. And Hannah, this lady, as it were, the episode concludes with that song. A song about how the lowly are raised up by God and how the mighty are brought low. And that would be the theme song for the whole series. That's the start of 1 Samuel. And then you had season 1, first half of 1 Samuel. Samuel grows up, but there's a leadership crisis in the land. Eli, the priest, and his sons don't lead well, so the people cry out for a king. And the ark is lost in the meantime. The glory is gone. And then they get to that king, Saul, and all seems to go well. But then, season 1 finale, 1 Samuel 15, Saul disobeys. And he is rejected by God. And he can no longer be king. And then it's the big cliffhanger, right? What's going to happen now? Who's going to be king? What's going to happen with the people? Season 2 starts, second half of 1 Samuel. The opening is Samuel goes to this young shepherd boy, David, and he is anointed to be the next king. And you think, oh, that's so hopeful. But the rest of the season shows all that persecution. Saul doesn't want him. David rises to power, becomes this famous general, kills giant Goliath and so on. But he is persecuted by Saul. And it all seems to go wrong again. What's going to happen? Who is king now? Is it rejected Saul, or is it newly anointed David? Or what's happening? And then last time when we concluded 1 Samuel, that was, as it were, the finale of season 2. Saul is in great despair. An enemy invasion is looming. And he goes to a witch. And he goes down the occult path. And he hears, no, next day you will be slain. And he dies in battle. Again, cliffhanger. What's happening now? Saul, the great king, has died. Who will now lead the people before God? So you could say, as it were, with 2 Samuel 1 today, we are starting season 3. It's not a brand new story. It's very much the continuation of what has gone before. And this season, as it were, tells us the rise of David. How he becomes king over the whole land and gave God's great promises to him. But, and then something you don't do with TV series, spoiler alert, this season will not end well like the previous ones. It will end with David sinning, right, with Bathsheba and Uriah. You might know the story that he let to have someone killed and he commits adultery and it's all going very wrong. And the prophet Nathan goes to him, he says, you are the man, you are going wrong. What's going to happen? Has the new king failed again? And the remainder of 2 Samuel would then be season 4, as it were. The downfall. David's house just spiraling out of control. Lots and lots of chaos. But there is an epilogue to the series. One more episode set 1,000 years later. And it is the birth of Jesus Christ. The great son in the line of David, fulfilling all the great promises made throughout those episodes. That line that was thread through everything. It led to the great king, a perfect king, who would truly be leading his people well. Now, that's the overview of the whole story, as it were. That's where it fits in the whole of the Bible. And we will continue this sermon series in 2 Samuel then, with looking at these exciting episodes, as it were, the individual stories. They teach us much about God and about us, our life in this world. But we must never forget that this is part of that bigger story, part of the bigger picture, God's unfolding plan to rule and bless his people through a king, leading them, representing them before God. A human king to rule on God's behalf. And in the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, that took shape in Israel, but it failed, just as Adam in the Garden of Eden had failed to represent humanity well. The story continues through it all. It all points forward to, and it calls for, it longs for that better King Jesus. Now, with that in mind, let's jump into this chapter that we read a moment ago, 2 Samuel in chapter 1. And in a way, it is like a recap, right? You might find it at the start of a season, recap of the last season. Where did we end again? Yes, it was with the death of King Saul. But now the focus is not on Saul himself and his fall. The focus is on David and how he hears that news. We see how David hears it, how he responds to it. It's a time of great crisis in Israel. Their first king is dead, and what will David do now? So, in times of crisis, that's how I've sort of titled the sermon, and we'll see various lessons. In times of crisis, firstly, some people will try to profit. In times of crisis, some will try to profit. Now, when we start the story in verse 1, we see that David is still outside of his land. He is in that town called Ziklag. It's in enemy territory. He was driven there by Saul. Saul persecuted him. All that time, God had been protecting him. God had intervened. God had intervened even that David would be far away from the battle in which Saul fell. So there was no risk that David was accused of doing a coup d'etat and rejecting, killing the previous king to get his place. No. But then, when he is still there in that enemy territory in Ziklag, a man comes to him, verse 2. A man comes with torn clothing and dust on his head. There's signs of mourning, so a man bringing bad news. And David wants to know what's happened, verse 3. Has this man got news from the war there up north in the country? And verse 4 shows us, yes, the news is as David might have feared by the looks of the man. The man says, the men fled from the battle, he replied. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. And then David asks for more info though. Was it really Saul? How could you know? How can this man know? And in verses 6 to 10, this man tells just a very elaborate story. He was there on the mountain too, and he got called over by Saul himself and helped to kill the king, took the crown, took the bracelet, armband. You might wonder, if you were with us when we looked at the previous chapter, 1 Samuel 31, these are very different accounts of how Saul died. What's going on here? Well, who do we trust? In this case, the story here is told by an Amalekite. And that should ring all the alarm bells already. Amalekites are not the good people. Amalekites, they have a bad place throughout the whole book. It's very ironic, really. Samuel, the prophet, foretold, Saul, you will die because you did not obey the Lord, destroying the Amalekites. So in a very real sense, you could say, ironically, the Amalekites did kill Saul. It led to his death, but it was not this individual. And the story is full of plot holes. It doesn't ring true. The king wouldn't be alone in the heat of battle. His servants, his armor bearer, his bodyguard will be there. How could just one Amalekite be the final guy to see King Saul? And if the Philistines are fast approaching, as he says, how can he get away with the crown and the armband and leave behind the body? It's much more likely that he made up this story when after the battle he was going plundering amongst the bodies. Now, what do you do then? David hears of Saul's death. You say, wow, it's the end of the persecution, right? This is huge for David. David had received promise that he would be king. Now, this was his time. Not just Saul was dead, even the crown prince, Jonathan, and his brother. Okay, we read in the coming chapters of another son of Saul, and it will prove complicated. But on the whole, the news seems to be, David, your road is clear. Pick the throne, get the place of power, and you'll be in a great place. What's going on? Is this good news? Well, the Amalekite clearly thinks so. David must think this is good news. I'll make sure I get in a good place with him, and I'll share in the reward. Maybe he will reward me richly for my bit. But no, David doesn't think it's good news at all. We'll come to his grief, as described in verses 11 and 12 in a moment, but this hit him very personally, as well as make him very deeply concerned for his people, Israel, now that they had lost their king. And indeed, he was concerned about the honor of God. We'll get there in a moment. But for now, see in verse 13 how David asked, where are you from? He wants to know more. And you can wonder, well, hadn't the man told him in verse 8, I am an Amalekite? Well, someone wrote, and I think this is helpful, where are you from? It's not so much what is your ethnic descent, what people group do you belong to, but where do you live? David wants to see, are you familiar with Israelites' ways, Israelite laws, with our society, our customs? And so he says, I am the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite, he answered. And foreigner there is sometimes translated as sojourner. Maybe you know that word from earlier in the Bible. It speaks of the non-Jewish people who lived in the land of Israel, the sojourners. They did not have inherited rights by being in the line from Abraham, but they had still the shared rights and responsibilities and privileges of living under the Old Covenant. The first books in the Bible are full of laws. You need to treat the sojourner among you, the foreigner who lives among you, in the same way as you treat your brothers and sisters, as it were, as the native Israelites. So the man describes himself as a sojourner. Basically says, I've lived in Israel. I know at least a bit of their ways, their laws, their customs. And it all highlights, as David shows in his response, he should have known better. He should have known that the anointed king of God cannot just be killed. And that David cannot accept this as good news. David's own actions in the book of 1 Samuel. You remember the story in the cave where Saul goes there for his bathroom stop and David cuts off a bit of his robe. He says to his men, I can't kill him. He is the Lord's anointed. Yes, he may be persecuting me, but I can't just do that. And there's another story with a similar point. See the emphasis in verses 14 to 16. Saul was the anointed of the Lord. He was Israel's king, called to rule under God. See the emphasis there. David asked him, verse 14, David asked him, why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And again in verse 16 at the end, your own mouth testified against you when you said, I killed the Lord's anointed. This is much more than just one man killing another man. This is the office of the king in Israel, anointed by the prophet of the Lord. This is a big thing. And that's why David responds with that appropriate justice and the loyalty to that office of king. He says, your own mouth testified against you. Because the seriousness of a sin depends on whom you are sinning against. So compare it with if you are saying bad words to someone. If you insult maybe your neighbor, that will be bad. It is wrong. But if you insult like when you bump into a police officer on duty and you insult him with the same words, it would be worse. Well, if you would meet King Charles and you would insult him with the same words, it would be even worse. How much more so if you insult God with those words? It will be terrible. It matters, even if the action or the wording is the same, whom you are sinning against matters. So this is not just wrong in the sense that one man claims to kill another man. It is far worse. He has killed the king. And the office of king needs to be protected and honored and valued, even though Saul himself had done so many wrong things. Which is why David, I think, responds with the death penalty. That was the context in those days. This man claims to have killed the king. The only right way to uphold the value, the honor of the king is that the man is punished. David himself had never put out his hand against Saul, and now he deals justly with someone who dishonored. Now, maybe to apply it a bit more to our current world. In this sinful world, in times of crisis, there will be people who try to turn things to their own gain and their own profit. You can compare it with all the political spin, right? When you read the news, somebody has done or said something wrong, and you can see all the opposition and all the other parties standing up, making the most use of that. They don't grieve for what has happened to the country or how it has affected other people. What they care for is, how can I make myself better in this context? They try to improve their own position. It happens in the church too, sadly. Maybe you've heard in recent weeks that another famous Christian leader has fallen. And you see the online pen warriors and podcasters going, right? They write and they post and they speak. They can build a platform now. You might never have heard of the guy before, but now suddenly every day, new post. Let me show you how wrong this guy was and why, and how my position is really the better one. Could well be truth in some of those things. There may well be wrong things. But what is the main response? Is it grief? Is it sadness because a leader has fallen? Is it sadness because of how that reflects on the Lord, on the gospel? How unbelievers will mock the gospel yet again? Or is it just a chance to build your platform and get more viewers? Maybe go even viral with one of your articles. D.A. Carson writes on this: that way Christ is despised and the credibility of Christian witness is diminished. Christians should restrain their tongues, watch what they say, and be especially careful about saying anything unnecessary to unbelievers. Such a time of a fall of a leader is a time for mourning, not gossip. Tell it not in Gath. And that final sentence is, of course, taken from the Song of David in verse 20. Because that's what we must secondly see. Secondly, in times of crisis, grief and lament are right. In times of crisis, grief and lament are right. We see two forms of grief in this chapter. We see in verses 11 and 12, as it were, the raw emotion, the initial hit of hardship. And then later, in verse 17 to 27, that song, we see a more thoughtful grief, you could call it. A more reflected response. Let's first look at that initial response in verses 11 and 12. Verse 11, then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening. And note the reasons: for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel. Here is no rejoicing that his persecutor is gone, or that David can now take the throne. No, there's deep grief for what the whole nation faces and how that reflects on God. Look at, it's the army of Yahweh, the army of the Lord. David, no, God's name is involved in this. And this is what happens when we hear bad news, isn't it? The emotions can just simply overwhelm us. There's little time, there's little brain space or emotional capacity for reflection in those early moments and days. The tears just come, and the numbness or the sort of all-encompassing feeling of sadness and grief. And this chapter, as many others in the Bible, shows that is okay. As Christians, we do not need to pretend. We may know the bigger picture, and we may know the Bible verses about sorrowful yet always rejoicing, and the Bible verses of God works everything together for good. Yes, but when a loved one dies, when something hard happens, There's just the deep pain and the loss and the questions. Why, O Lord? How long, O Lord? When pain continues or suffering continues. We may be tempted then to apologize for tears. I've been in so many of those situations, and somebody just pouring out their hearts in grief, and you oh, sorry, you shouldn't be crying. No, we can cry. Christians are allowed to cry. We don't need to pretend. Jesus himself wept when his friend Lazarus died. Maybe if you were at the prayer meeting last Thursday, when Paul and the Ephesian elders in the church, they're separating, and Paul says, you will never see me again. What do we read? Acts 20. They all wept as they embraced him and kissed him. What grieved them most was his statement that they would never see his face again. This is a proper response. How long something like that lasts, or just how it is experienced, is different for each situation and each person. And we've all got different characters. We've all got different emotional strengths and weaknesses and ways of expressing that. And especially within families, for example, you can sometimes get a bit of tension that somebody is sort of soon with the way they respond, and then it's also soon over. Others, it comes a bit later, but it lasts longer. And there's just different ways in which we can respond to that. Maybe a personal disclaimer here. I'm only a fairly inexperienced pastor, and I've, by the providence of God, not experienced that much deep grief up close. Life has been pretty comfortable in that sense. There's been periods of hardship and suffering, of course, but grief, I can learn from some of you and others in the church much more than you might be able to learn from me, at least on an experiential level. I might be able to help saying things, okay, this is what the Bible teaches us, but in experience, there's some of you who learn much more going through that. I heard from the Canadian blogger Tim Challies, the Christian. Maybe you've read some of his articles, really good. Some 5 years ago, he lost his son Nick when the young boy was only 20 years old, his son Nick. And what he said was so helpful in the way he reflected on that and dealt with that. One thing he says is that they were so glad that they had the theology of suffering and grief and lamenting sort of readily in place when this hit them. It didn't, in a sense, make it any easier, but they could speak to their emotions with truth. That's how he put it. And he said, even then, a verse that is sometimes considered cliche, sadly, Romans 8:28, that everything works together for good. He said, knowing that did make all the difference. I could bring it to God. And so even, as I said, even if you haven't had much deep grief or personal suffering yet, it is good to have the theology and the Bible's teaching on this readily in place, so that when it comes in this broken world, we know how to respond well, and we can put things in context based on the Word of God. He also said how it was just an incredible comfort to them, how people would come over and sometimes maybe in a stumbling way try to comfort them. And he said, as brothers and sisters, you can be gracious to them. You know they want to just help and surround you with love and care. And you seek the grace and the love in what the others try and show, even if it sometimes comes out in a stumbling way. But it was such an incredible comfort, he said, to have that truth in place and to have the church to lean on. And so as a church family, I think we should seek too, we can seek to support one another in times of crisis. In the early days of the more raw emotions, as well as later on when grief just lingers and continues. Keeping away altogether or staying quiet out of fear to say something wrong is not the helpful way. We can just be present and we can show that we care, and we can pray for God to strengthen and help and comfort. So that's the early, maybe the initial way that grief shows itself. But when time passes, however long that may be in your individual situation, even if the initial raw emotions aren't there anymore, or not as often, or not as much, then still the grief continues. The loss is still there, or the hardship might linger on. The what could have been is still not received. But with the passing of time, there is also more room for reflection. And that's what we see in verses 17 to 27. They describe David's song, a lament. He has spent time thinking over the initial hardship and grief. He has spent time finding the exact right words to put them in a song to be taught to the whole nation, so that they too can learn how to respond well to this crisis. So one commentator said this is thoughtful grief, this lamenting, teaching others. It's a desire to put things in context and reflect on it and see further implications and then put that in the right words. And again, this is very much an appropriate thing for us as Christians to do and to have. In this world, under the curse of sin, some things just won't be fixed till we see Jesus. Jesus will one day renew all things, and we can have that hope looking forward. But some things in this life, while it lasts, remain difficult. Christians will still die and be persecuted and face suffering. And the New Testament is full of it, and that is not natural. It's not part of how God made the world. It is what sin brought into the world. And as long as sin remains, it is right to lament. One commentator, Dale Rolf Davies, he says this: the sorrows and wounds God's people receive from their losses are not miraculously healed after a short time of emotional release. And sometimes in the church there's such an impatience with grief. But the laments that we find in the Bible assume that our grief can be deep and ongoing, and invite us to enter in the discipline of expressing that grief in words that convey our anguish, or in images that picture our despair, or in written prayers that put into words just how much we are full of sorrow. Why should God's people be shoddy in their sorrow, he writes. And so as David reflected then on the death of Saul and Jonathan, he wrote this song. And I won't go through all the details here, but we see his Godward focus. Even though there isn't much mention of God, the way he has put this together shows that he was thoroughly informed by a godly and a Godward look at life. Again, remember, this was the fall of a king. In Israel's king, that was huge. Just as earlier in the book of Samuel, when the ark left the land, a boy was given the name Ichabod. The glory is gone. The glory of God is gone. And so it is here. If you look at verse 19, in our NIVs it says, a gazelle lies slain on your heights. If you've got an ESV Bible with you, it says, the glory, your glory, O Israel, is slain on your heights. That word is a bit tricky to translate. It could be gazelle, it could be glory. And it shows maybe just a quick and a gracious animal. And later in the song it shows us that it is about Jonathan mostly. But it is also glory. As David reflects here, he says, this is not just the death of a man. This is much more. This is the glory of God impacted and gone and obscured through this event. This was the anointed of the Lord and his son, the crown prince. And so then he says in verse 20, tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Those were Philistine cities. And of course, those people knew that Saul was dead. They had done it. They had put the bodies on the walls of a city. It's terrible. But David laments on how they would not just share news, but they would rejoice. And they would go through their towns dancing and singing. And David reflects over that, and he says, the glory of God is impacted here. This is not just them celebrating the defeat of Israel's king, but they will celebrate the defeat of Israel's God. And that is just terrible. Again, thinking of failure of Christian leaders today, is our biggest concern how it reflects on God? How it reflects on Jesus and the gospel? How that is something to deeply grieve over beyond the individual that it concerns? Another lesson from this song, as David has reflected on it, is in verses 22 and following, how it is very neutral to positive about Saul. Did you notice that? He doesn't make a song and he's all about Saul was a bad guy and he disobeyed the Lord and he persecuted me and thankfully he's gone. Not at all. He overlooks, as it were, Saul's failures and he focuses on what is good. That Saul brought more peace to the nation than the time of the judges. That Saul was a great warrior. That he had brought some prosperity to the women, verse 24. Weep for Saul, daughters of Israel, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. He tries to remember the good bits. People are not purely black, purely white generally, or purely good, purely evil. After the passing of someone, only wallowing in the bad and reflecting on that won't help. That's not what David did here anyway. And this is really hard to understand perhaps, when we remember how David was so persecuted by Saul. But he trusted in the Lord. The Lord had helped him all those years of persecution. And so now in the song he gives to his people, he doesn't want to remember that, and he doesn't want to drag Saul's name through the dirt yet again. No, he remembers the good that Saul brought. And even having said that, it stays a bit distant, doesn't it? Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul. Verse 25, how the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. There is a clear difference there. He calls on the nation, as it were, to remember the fall of their king. Personally for him, the fall of Jonathan went far, far deeper. Verse 26, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. Sadly, again, it should say here that verse is so often explained in a very unhelpful way. Someone wrote, it's utterly wrong-headed to read into this the idea of homosexuality, as if Jonathan and David had something going on. That's just terrible. The comparison between Jonathan's love and a wife's love, this author said, it's not at the point of sexuality, it's the point of fidelity, it's trust. Jonathan showed his love with deep trustworthiness. That he knew David was going to be king, and Jonathan was going to be second at best, and yet he stayed loyal to David, and strengthened David, and supported David. Jonathan was a very trustworthy, supportive friend. And in that, David greatly rejoiced, and they were very close. They were kindred spirits, as it were, but together loving God. Now, this song is just one of the many laments in the Bible. Thoughtful grief has a place in our lives. It's right to mourn over evil and suffering, but as we do so, we must remember God, our good and sovereign Father. And we must respond in a Godward way, just like David shows us here, just like the Psalms show. Because when we do that, in conclusion, in times of crisis, we should keep leaning on the Lord. In conclusion, then, let's keep leaning on the Lord. Let's not lean, as we've seen before from David, let's not lean on our own plans, on our own shortcuts. Let's lean on God, who is working out his plans. Think of what we said earlier on about the bigger storyline, where this story fits. In the coming chapters, we'll see that David has to wait yet 7 more years before he rules over all of Israel. There will be 7 years of civil war and lots of fighting and terrible scheming and leaders and influencers trying to vie for power. They all rise up against the Lord and his anointed, in the words of Psalm 2. But as we sang this morning, though the nations rage, kingdoms rise and fall, there is still one king reigning over all. So I will not fear, for this truth remains, that my God is the Ancient of Days. And in all this then, we see how it points us to the cross of Jesus. That was the greatest time of crisis ever. Judas, one of the 12, thought he could profit from it all. He thought, I can get a bit richer. Give me that bag of money, I'll tell you where you can find Jesus. The Jewish leaders and Pilate, they cared only for their own political position. The disciples grieved. But they kept looking to and leaning on the Lord, who was working out his plan of salvation. And then Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus proved himself to be God's forever king, that long-promised Messiah, the Christ, the King in the line of David, who, as we saw this morning, who has all authority in heaven and on earth. The Savior King, who is surely with us always till the end of the days. Jesus is the great King who still today is in control. He is working in and through everything towards the day when he will set all things right and resolve every crisis. And just then, as David kept leaning on God and received great promises about that descendant who would one day come, we know his name. And we can lean on him, Jesus, the Savior, the rock, the shield, a sure person that we can lean on, the God-man, our rescuer, our King. We'll sing in a moment of him being our rock and our Redeemer. We can lean on him in times of great crisis. And where else would you go? And in and through Jesus then, as our closing song will say, we have a hope burning in our hearts for every passing day. A hope that lifts my weary head, a consolation strong against despair, that when the world has plunged me in its deepest pit, I find the Saviour there. Through present sufferings and future fear, he whispers courage in my ear, for I am safe in everlasting arms, and they will lead me home. So let's lean on the Lord, shall we? Amen.